introduce you to a friend of mine from the Academy of Jewish Religion, Michael Salonius. And as Catherine already wonderfully demonstrated, we are not only chaplains in a plural world, we are also plural ourselves. So Michael is here to talk to us about that. Welcome.
Thank you very much. What time am I going to?
20, 30 minutes.
Cool. Excellent. Well, first, I would like to start by actually acknowledging that today is, we say in Hebrew, Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's very important for me as a Jewish chaplain to at least acknowledge and have just a brief moment of silence. Thank you. I didn't realize that today was going to be Yom HaShoah. So that was an unexpected moment. I'm almost reticent to talk about hybridity in theological terms because there's, at least in my experience in the academy, a tremendous amount of emphasis in looking at theological systems as they are in and of themselves. To put it philosophically, and I promise I won't be so esoteric and verbose as I get into this, but there almost is an appreciation of theological systems as they are epistemological entities in and of themselves, and I get that. However, I don't think in a phenomenological reality, at least one that I live in, that that's the real world, right? My life is not composed of epistemological systems that are very accurately delineated between me and that system, you know? And I think that this is reflected in everything I've heard today. And it's, I mean, the word chaplain, the word chaplain in and of itself, when I signed up to go to school to become a Jewish chaplain, oh, that's rad. Jewish chaplain, how cool. And then I've had multiple experiences in various Jewish seminaries, and so I thought this would be neat. And then after I had started the program, it never occurred to me to look up the etymology of what chaplain means. I was shocked to find out. You know, that chaplain means little cloak, right? Little cloak. Little cloak of who? Saint Martin. Saint Martin's little cloak. He was an early Christian in the church, and he cut his cloak in half after he had been conscripted in the Roman army to lend to a cold soldier. And he actually might be the first conscientious objector in terms of his religious disposition. So the idea of being a Jewish chaplain in and of itself is a hybrid place to occupy, or a Buddhist chaplain. I mean, anything other than a Catholic chaplain in and of itself is technically, if we want to be really philosophically accurate, a hybrid designation. So I feel almost ill-equipped to speak in an academic way about hybridity. So the only thing I have is my personal experience as a result of doing the work. It's very Jewish to tell stories to illustrate points. So I come from a lineage, a Hasidic lineage of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, or Breslov as insiders call it. And he tells this story. It's called The Story of the Turkey Prince. So there was a king, And the king had a fabulous kingdom, and a lot of his subjects were very pleased with his rule. And there was justice and order, I dare say equanimity in his kingdom. And so the subjects of the king were very well disposed to his authority in the kingdom. And the king would be really pleased if it wasn't for the fact that his one son, his heir to the kingdom, the prince, was mad. He had gone completely insane, and he believed he was a turkey. And the prince hid underneath the king's table. And it, you know, like any table fit for royalty, it had a rich tablecloth, and it was a very large table in the kingdom, in the castle, big enough for a naked adult to live underneath it. And to keep him alive, they would, you know, feed him underneath the table, but he would only pick at the scraps. He wouldn't eat food, and he refused to wear clothes. And the king sought the doctors and the spiritual wise men of the kingdom, and no one could fix his son's madness. And so he sent word, of course, this is, you know, in the story, is north and south and east and west, but eventually someone did come and said, I can help your son, but you have to. You have to do exactly what I say when I say it. And the king, ready to engage in some discussion, you know, the wise man said, no, it's really important for the sake of your son, that when I ask for something, you do it and you do not question what I'm about to do. And so the king acquiesced. So the wise man stripped off his clothes, got naked, and went underneath the table. And at first the prince was radically terrified that there was another person under the table with him. And he moved to the other side and squawked and made a commotion. And so the wise men, in like fashion, squawked and behaved like a turkey. And did so to the point that the prince started to become comfortable with this other presence in the table, underneath the table. When they would have meals and they would leave the food and the prince would only peck at the scraps, the wise men would only peck at the scraps. Until eventually, at one point, the wise men made a signal. He said, please bring us some real food. And he started to eat the real food. And the prince became outraged. You're a turkey. You can't eat human food. How can turkeys eat human food? You're a turkey. And the wise men said, I am a turkey. But that doesn't mean I can't eat human food too. I can be a turkey and eat human food. And he continued to eat without trying to persuade the prince. The prince noticed there was another bowl and decided, well, okay, if it's good enough for him, I'll do it. He's a turkey. I can trust the turkey. And he started to eat. And so he became accustomed to eating human food again. And then the wise men signaled. And clothes were laid out. And so he dressed, and at this, the prince freaked out, squawked, and made a horrible commotion. How can you dress like a human? You're a turkey. We turkeys do not dress like humans. And the wise men said, I can be a turkey and still wear a human outfit. It does not threaten my turkeyness. And the prince was, after all, a little bit chilly. So he decided that he too could put on clothes. And as the story goes on, we see how he became accustomed to being a person again. Now I share that story because for me, it has the ability to encapsulate and transcend what I believe chaplaincy is for me. And that is to meet people where they're at. on their terms, without having to impose my system onto them, yet at the same time, not have to abandon exactly what it is I bring underneath the table too. I was really impressed listening to the panels, or to the discussions ahead of me. And I work primarily, I should give you some context, yeah, right? A little bit about my background. I started off in rabbinic school a long time ago. I ended up going into clinical social work, became a psychoanalyst, terrifying stuff. And I don't recommend it to anyone. And that's a joke. And then only later in life decided, right? I'm so old. But I decided at one point to get back into the theological, to the religious game, and check out Jewish chaplaincy. And for me, there was this point of departure. I don't know, I had left the seminary, the Jewish would call it yeshiva, right, where that Talmudic debate occurs in all of its miserable rigor and accusation. And for those of you who haven't ever experienced that, it can be traumatizing. It's constant adversarial relationships from the moment you're up until the moment you're out of the school, and that's the yeshiva life. I don't know if it's common or uncommon, but growing up here in Southern California, hybridity was built into my experience. I have an incredibly redneck, anti-Semitic family on my father's side who's not Jewish, and I have this Hasidic family on my. We say Hasidic, but you can tell an insider because they put the sh at the end. And so my mom fled the Hasidic world to become one of our notorious and infamous Jews here in Southern California. And so I grew up in a world that was hybrid, but didn't know it was hybrid. My exposure to anti-Semitism was in my family. And so self-loathing felt natural to me. Likewise, incorporating Hebrew prayer with Buddhist meditation never seemed dissimilar. So I had a mother in the end of the day who would call in the light, say the Shema, and teach me how to meditate. That's odd. I didn't know it was odd, but looking back on it now, I can say, that was a strange experience. So by the time it came time for my rebellion, later on in life, I became a chassid. That was the way to rebellion, was to become an Orthodox Jew. But when I decided to leave the yeshiva, because ultimately, for me, I could not maintain that kind of a lifestyle for too long. And I'm being sparse for the sake of time, but I had a lot of contact with Buddhism. As a matter of fact, my professor of Jewish mysticism, this is very Thomas Merton-esque, but was also a Zen Buddhist priest. And so that's where I started to really formally study a strain of Zen Buddhism, specifically. I'll use the Japanese terminology because, although it was taught to me in more of a Chinese fashion, but the Rinzai, and then specifically the Fuke, that character who in the story, and I love that there is such synchronicity. I know synchronicity is also one of these dangerous words today, because it implies a collusion, perhaps. But the familiarity of Zen stories with Hasidic stories, I think, have a tremendous amount of similarity. And the story of Fook in the street, ringing a bell and yelling, "When it comes in the light, I will strike the light. And when it comes in darkness, I will strike the darkness. And when it comes in a whirlwind, I will flail it. And when it comes out of the blue," oh, I misquoted myself. "When it comes from all directions, I will hit it like a whirlwind. And when it comes from the blue, I will flail it." And that typified the way that I was to experience both Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism. For example, another interesting correlation, there is a text, and pretty much anybody who's ever been in any major city has met a Chabad rabbi. They're the Jews who are on the corner asking, "Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Have you put on tefillin today? Have you put on tefillin today?" They're in hospitals, street corners. They have trucks that say the mitzvah mobile. But they were a very logical. They systematized Jewish mysticism in a very cohesive, very westernized way. Things that I think is very appropriate for understanding how I understand hybridity is we have in Buddhism, and I'm not. I mean, like the Buddhist chaplains before me. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a Jewish chaplain. In many ways, I feel like I'm a Trojan horse in traditional Jewish communities. But the idea of the five skandhas, right, these aggregates of behaviors that are, I don't want to say deterministic, but have outcomes in terms of how we, explanation or phenomenological underpinnings as to why we behave and do certain things. And in the Tanya, which is this book of Hasidic Jewish mysticism, there is 5 aggregate souls. And the term soul is a poor term because it doesn't translate accurately, because it doesn't necessarily mean what we use in English, but that these 5 aggregate souls come together, and that is the composite of where they meet that creates the person. And so the idea of personhood in Jewish mysticism is not monolithic or singular. So what I believe is that we have already in our respective theological systems built-in mechanisms for recognizing hybridity. I was worried upon starting my chaplaincy program how I would encounter folks who wanted Christian prayer. And that was a concept that was a concern that you so really eloquently put forward, and how that you dealt with it. And it's interesting. It's interesting. The term Judeo-Christian. I only hear Christians use this term, Judeo-Christian. Because it seems to be the case that Judaism really is in the designation of Eastern religions, and that's just not my opinion. There's a lot of good scholarship to substantiate that claim. But one of the concepts that comes from, and if you've ever seen traditional Jewish prayer, it's very, very involved, and it has to be done. It is very formulaic. You start with a set of prayers that preface the prayer, right? And then there's the call to prayer, and then there's the preparation for the main prayer, the Shema, which is the declaration of faith. Then there's the declaration of faith. Then there's the please, I'm not worthy to be able to pray before you. And then there's the actual the only part of the prayer service which is the requests. And then it goes into the Torah service. They pull the Torah out and they read from that. And then there's the concluding prayers. And then there's the designation of the concluding prayers that we're about to end the prayers, right? And if anything is out of order, well, that prayer is absolutely obsolete and you've done it wrong and it's time to start over again, right? It's like experiential education. And, I mean, and that's the way it's taught in normal orthodoxy. But there's a Hasidic understanding, and it really helped reconcile. Because left to my own devices, like if I were to pray outside of any community, I would have something that looked somewhat similar to something Islamic in terms of my kneeling, combined with my Zen Buddhist meditation practice, with just a few Hebrew prayers that reference divinity in a way that is not always recognizable to my fellow Jews. And that's me alone. But I understand that I am not alone. I am a part of a community, and I serve a community. And as the three folks who sat up here before me so eloquently stated, I'm on loan from my community to secular spheres. And so I represent my community to a certain extent when I'm there. And so it's important to be really well versed in the theological system that I am representing, even if I don't always subscribe to all those systems. And I was inspired to share, there is this Hasidic, and again, in Hasidic for me is a mystical or in phenomenological terms, it has transcendental subjectivity, right? There's another $5 word for your SATs, for my SAT. And that within everything is a principle. We say this in Hebrew, it's a midah, and the plural is midot. So there's in prayer principles that transcend the literal words being spoken. And so starting in the 1600s, there were different prayer books that emphasized those principles or midot as opposed to the specific words. And so I've begun to think of articulate prayer as a form of concentrated meditation, a mantra, a chanting, so to speak. And then to transcend that literal meaning into the midot, or those principles, and then elevate those principles to the sake of what it is that I'm focusing my conscious mind on in that process. And that's been that is an intersecting point, again, of hybridity for me, where I might not, and depending on which day, the question, do you believe in God? Do I believe in God? Ask me on what day, and I'll give you a different answer. I don't have an answer for that. An interesting aspect, and if I had a whiteboard, I would draw it. Another very interesting similarity between Buddhism and Judaism is looking back at the text, looking at the Pali, looking at the Hebrew, because all translation is ultimately interpretation. And one of the things that I find is both common in the Hasidic experience and what I learned in Zen Buddhism is that, especially from another, not my immediate teacher, but another teacher, is that there is no authority other than my own experience. Otherwise, it's imposed upon me. And so what is most authoritative is my own experience. And so in that sense, I think that we are moved to go to the source material often. And I think that that's a very promising point of interconnectedness, that we look at the texts to the degree in which they're still present and come to our understandings based on an actual encounter with the text. And this word God that can be so problematic in chaplaincy, I find, in and of itself is a hybrid word. At least in its Hebraic origin, and to share, how am I doing on time? What's?
5 minutes.
Okay, cool. I'll wrap this up. God. About my head. When Moses ascends Mount Sinai, right, and he says, God, show me your face, and God refuses, and then he has his head in the cleft, and then God passes, so he passes back, right? There is this inability to experience the divine, so much so that prior to that, at the burning bush moment, which is, anybody who's ever watched the Ten Commandments, that Charlton Heston film can attest to this. He says, who shall I say sent me? Moses says to God, and God says in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, right? And that's often translated as I am what I am, right? And theologians have spilled tons of ink on what does that mean. The ontological reality of God is what I was first told, and I thought, well, that's impressive. And I still to this day don't really quite understand what ontological means, but I have a good idea of what it might possibly mean. But and then I had another scholar. So when I started to get really good at Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh literally translated means I will be what I will be. And as I was exposed to philologists, it was kind of like a Hebrew idiom, like, none of your business, kid. Which is really informative on one level, right? You want to know who I am? I'm not going to tell you who I am. But then in and of itself, the etymology of that weird word, right? And you always hear it like, the Lord our God, the Lord our God. And that word Lord isn't Lord at all. It's commonly transliterated as Yahweh. It was mistranslated in the King James Version as Jehovah. But it is 4 letters, the tetragrammaton, right? The Yud, He, Vav, He. A very interesting word composing 4 consonants. Because the word for will be in Hebrew is Yud, He, pronounced Ehyeh, will be. And the word for was, right, present but past tense, was, Haya. And the word for present tense is Hoveh. And when you combine future, past, and present, I didn't make this up, right? I mean, this is just, the word Yahweh, or Yehovah, or Yahava, or whatever, is not only unpronounceable, but it's really kind of inconceivable, because it has a dimension of future, past, present, which kind of imposes upon me an experience of utter nowness. Utter nowness that defies my ability to have any authority over what that means. And how that informs my chaplaincy is that God, not God, yes. And can I pray and witness your prayer, even if it is dissimilar to mine? I will witness your prayer. And depending on what day it is, if my atheism is particularly strong and I've read a little bit too much Dawkins, or Hitchens, or am moved by how traumatic experiences can be for people, I'm aware that I have no capital over what this omnipresent experience is that we're all encountering in our own way and trying to explicate in forums like this. As a result, you know, my experience is that when I come to, and I primarily, my end game is to be a prison chaplain. Prison chaplaincy is where I really want to be. And I'm sure, like, you know, there's so much bureaucracy involved with the California Department of Corrections. I have to have my 4 CPE units before I can start that process. And interestingly, and I'll end with a story. You know, back in another time, I was working at a bookstore, one of those big box-top bookstores. I believe I had a hangover. I haven't had a hangover in many years, but back then I had quite a few. And this Benedictine monk came in, and he was looking for a book. And I said, I think I can help you find this book. Right? You know, it was obviously in the religious section. And at the time, with my tattoos, you wouldn't have known that I had had any exposure to a really serious religious education. And about 20 years ago, I don't know. And the Benedictine monk and I started to talk and got involved in this conversation. I found his book, and he stopped and he paused and he said, "Hey, would you like to go to prison?" I'm like, "Hell no, I know." Not to disclose too much, but I've been to jail, and it wasn't on my terms, you know. No desire to go back. He said, "No, I'm a prison chaplain." And he said, "I've never done this before, but I feel moved by the Spirit," which as a Jew is very uncomfortable. Take your spirit. But he said, "I feel moved by the Spirit that you might really want to come with me and experience what it's like to be a prison chaplain." I'll be damned. I'll give it a go, right? And I said, "But I have to tell you, you know, I didn't know, brother, I'm not Catholic." He's like, "That doesn't matter. That's not what chaplaincy is about." I said, "Okay." And so I went through and you know, much to my surprise, I cleared that preliminary background, and they gave me a pass to go to North County Correctional Facility. And I got to see what Brother Will McKinley did. And so for this Jew, who is informed substantially by Buddhism, was put on this path by a Benedictine Catholic monk. I believe that the experience that I have doing work with other chaplains is kind of creating something that I believe ought, and I say ought with all of its moral implication. I believe that this experience of CPE, of having different people from different backgrounds coming together and explore what it is like to engage in real substantive spiritual care, is having, to use the words of Jewish mysticism, a tikkun. It is repairing damage on a cosmic level. That when we come together with our disparate beliefs and we find this internalness that we all share, there is something transformative that occurs. And it's easy for me to lose, especially when I'm in my Jewish seminary filled with a bunch of Jews who have different opinions than I do and who pray they should change how they pray. And I, you know, if I could impose my will, it would be very different. And then I can get wrapped up into all of the dynamics that occur, at least at the Jewish seminary. I've never been in a traditional Buddhist seminary, so I can't speak to that experience. The Jewish seminaries are really frustrating. There is an experience that I hope, as I am transformed by it, that I would like for us. I believe that we are transforming the secular community where it is often ruled in these dichotomous relationships of us versus them, as opposed to that divinity or that Buddha nature that is experienced when two people encounter each other without the goal of imposing one's position onto the other, and there is a real intersubjective experience. So in true Hasidic fashion, I'll end my piece with another story of my Rebbe, Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. It's much shorter than the first one. He was yet again another king, go figure. And this king was told that there was going to be a famine in his land. And like all good rulers, wanted to ensure the survival of his kingdom, and so he implored his agents, do we have enough grain stored to survive several years of famine? And his agents came and said, yes, we have enough grain stored. But the caveat is that this grain, as it has been stored for so long, has been infected. And while it will keep us alive, all of us who eat of it will become mad. And the king was not pleased to hear this. But his primary wise men came to him and spoke to him in private and said, I have anticipated an event such as this. And I have stored enough grain for many years for just you and me. It has not been infected, so you and I can eat it, and we will not go mad. And we will be able to rule the kingdom justly, while the inhabitants are mad. And the king meditated and reflected on this and thought, no, for that would not be wise. Because if we are sane while everyone else is insane, then we will appear to be ultimately the ones insane. So what you and I will do is we will eat the grain with everyone else, and we will encounter madness with everyone else. But you and I will put a mark on each other's foreheads, so that way, at least when we see each other, we will remember that we are mad. And that way, we'll be able to be of greater service in the long run. And if that begs more questions than it answers, then I definitely have done my job as trying to express a hybrid Jewish chaplaincy. So I think I'll suffice it and let it rest at that spot. So, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. So, a few questions. There we go.
So what do you say to the Christian that says, pray for me?
Absolutely. Well, on a very practical level, I'm very good at spontaneous prayer. What I do not do is I do not pray with the normative Christian conclusion in Jesus' name. Now, if they want to, I will gladly say amen to their prayer and witness their prayer. And I will gladly say a spontaneous prayer up until that point with them. And if they want to add that in conclusion, I'm really comfortable with that. But that is a boundary that I have. So I will go as far as to recite non-normative Jewish prayers, and spontaneous prayer is a very, very abnormal event within Jewish environments. but I have very, very comfortable for me to engage in that kind of spontaneous prayer with Christians, or with whomever at that point.
So I have a quick question, which is I had actually heard, because I know that prayer in the Jewish tradition is very formal, but I had heard that there is actually a spontaneous prayer tradition for Hasids.
Right.
Okay.
And there absolutely is.
So maybe you can speak to that, but the other part of my question was if you could just clarify your context right now, your clinical context, because I don't know anything about that, where you're doing your,
Right.
Where you're on the floor or whatever you're doing when you're not doing the education part of CPE.
Gotcha. And I was intentionally vague about that. There is a concept, at least, and different Hasidic, Hasidism, the mystical community in Jewry today, is not like the Hasidism that it started off with, which was a very rebellious movement that has now become very institutionalized. So even the spontaneous prayer that was originally the Hasidic spontaneity has become ritualized in and of itself. However, there is, at least in my tradition, I can speak with certainty about that process of what we call hitbodedut. Hitbodedut is a fancy Hebrew word for saying the aloneness required for being in devekut, in union, where the ego is sublimated and experience of the divine is all encompassing. And that's by praying in an almost free associative manner, not unlike a psychoanalytic experience. And so that is at least the tradition that I come from, and that I feel the most comfortable speaking with both academic certainty and personal experience. My clinical sites, plural, and the reason why I was vague is because I have a private practice, and my private practice is subcontracted with various organizations like rehabs, drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers, 2 different organizations that deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, with returning veterans who are coming back. And so my clinical sites are these locations where I'm also engaged in as an analyst as well, and a trauma counselor. So that's why I was intentionally vague, because it gets complex at that point.
Other questions? Wow, you're such a good one. You understood absolutely everything.
Well, what's really clear, my first Buddhist teacher just always cut it down to the basic. Life is experience, not understood. And here you said it all.
Really no questions? Please. Because I don't feel like I made any sense.
No, well, I'm interested in now knowing about your clinical work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in well, because there's like academically speaking, there's a difference between pastoral care and pastoral counseling, and of course pastoral is a very Christian term, but in the academy, at least over where I'm at, that's what we say. So I'm just curious, and then to have your training as a psychoanalyst, how do the two become, they can't really be separated, or how does, where is it spiritual care, where is it analysis?
So Monica can actually bear witness to some of this, as our supervisor is constantly encouraging me in CPE to break my psychoanalytic habits. However, the particular field that I was most conversant in, intersubjective analysis, which is really informed, oddly, to talk about the synchronicity of contemplative psychotherapy, which, as we all know, is very Buddhist-based. And so what I'm finding is that that in terms of losing my psychoanalytic proclivity and regaining it, as it is ultimately, I'm ultimately unable to shirk myself of it entirely. And what I'm finding is that there's a lot more confluence between my spiritual practice and the psychoanalytic world that I used to be so fully involved in. But most importantly, in terms of chaplaincy, of being a pastoral care provider, it has taught me how to ask good questions. So when I'm engaged with another, the ability to listen deeply for what isn't being said, and then to ask questions that hopefully allow that person to occupy more space in that environment and then hold that space for them. I see the two as very synonymous. Just this one happens to be more rewarding because it feels more authentic. If that answers that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Michael. We're going to take a short 5-minute break because I am totally a prisoner of the ivory tower and I have a PowerPoint. But I promise it will be the last presentation, so thank you for all of those who hung in there all afternoon, and we'll be back in just 5 minutes.